Okay, I think now we are safe to start. Thank you very much again for coming to the classroom. Today we are going to talk about the very famous Donghuang Buddha Caves. Before we start the contents on Donghuang, I just wanted to again emphasize this is very important. I think probably it made autocorrect because I was typing both Qin and Qing, so somehow it was mixed up. So the first unified Chinese empire should be Qin without a G. So the last one, last imperial dynasty, is a huge difference. So please, yes, correct this mistake. The typal mistake, it should be Qin, not Qing. And I also wanted to thank a couple of students who pointed this out. So today what we are going to cover is the transmission of Buddhism. We did talk about the transmission of Buddhism to China from a large perspective, but today we are going to talk about Buddhism itself, from where it was originated and who actually helped became the patron of Buddhism and helped to spread Buddhism. The second part, and then the most important part, would be the significance of Donghuang in the world history, not just as Buddhist caves, but also in other arenas as well, and as well as Donghuang today. So again, I wanted to remind you of this map, basically, the importance of the Tarim Basin, as well as Afghanistan and Pakistan, northern part of India, and further to the Persian world, which is not exactly pointed out here. But yes, so all the archaeological sites, the most important parts that are in close connection with the Silk Road studies would be largely discovered from here. And we can see Donghuang here is either spelled as Tonghuang or Donghuang. Yes, there are always various kinds of spelling of names. Because, again, the variation of names is, again, because the historical changes and how peoples are recorded in different historical sources, in different languages, and also in different historical periods. For example, yesterday one student asked me about Uyghur, what is exactly the correct spelling? Is it U-I-G-H-U-R or U-Y-G-H-U-R? It's a very good question, and sometimes it is also spelled as U-I-G-U-R as well. So, but just remember, it is okay for you to use any of the spellings as long as it is consistent. But there is a kind of a division line, I guess, up until 1990s. Uyghurs, the mentioning of Uyghurs mostly appeared in the historical research, like in the sphere of history studies. So until then, and also started some anthropological approaches when the Chinese government allowed researchers to go and do research in Xinjiang. And until then, it was largely used as U-I-G-H-U-R, especially in historical research, as referring to the ancient and also modern Uyghur. But then, starting from late 1990s and turn of the centuries, especially the political situation is kind of being exacerbated by media, etc. And more political scientists are referring to the Uyghurs, academics referring to the Uyghurs as U-Y-G-H-U-R. Now it is becoming more standard in both media and academic writing about contemporary Uyghurs and Uyghur situation using Y. But they are just the same people, really. Again, it's evoluted, yes, throughout different time periods. So here, Donghuang and Tonghuang would be, and the lowland, for example, in the local language would be Kiroran or Kroran, and in Chinese would be lowland. Lowland would be the transliteration of Kiroran, for example. So, yes, and sometimes some places are referred to in the local name, in historical books, but also because many of the writings are written in Chinese, and Chinese would again transliterate it historically, then, or simply just translate it, or just given a new Chinese name. In that circumstances, then again, there are always different names, looks absolutely different in pronunciations and in the spelling, but again, it's just because of who has written these documents, documented these places. So if we talk about Buddhism, then we have to look at the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, because especially in the northern part, that would be where Buddhism sprung up, starting from the 5th century BCE. So Buddhism is really very ancient, and we could say possibly either at around the same time of Zoroastrianism, but it can be generally agreed that Zoroastrianism, again, is probably earlier than the arrival of Buddhism. Zoroastrianism probably could be traced back to over 3,000 years ago, again, because of the lack of documentation, written documentations. It's difficult to verify, but Buddhism's documentation is quite reliable around the 5th century BCE. So Siddhartha Gautama is who would be later known after his death as the Buddha, or Buddha Shakyamuni or Sakyamuni, again in different languages. And the Buddha refers to or translated as the awakened or the enlightened one. So this image would be the creation probably around the 2nd century BCE, after the Alexander the Great's conquest of this area, and there was more Hellenistic influence, so it's typically called Greco-Buddhist art or Gandhara art to some extent, but largely, especially during that time, would be called Greco-Buddhist art, so with Hellenistic influence. This is discovered in Gandhara in eastern part of Afghanistan. So today we are going to mention two very important patrons of Buddhism, and one is King Ashoka in the late 3rd century BCE and 2nd century BCE. King Ashoka really was the person who brought the subcontinent together under one empire, the great empire of the subcontinent, that is Mauryan Empire. So Mauryan Empire, apart from some small, as these dots kind of separated out, probably the very southern extreme of the Indian subcontinent. Basically, it covered what we now know as Pakistan and some parts of India, Bhutan, for example. All this area were part of the Mauryan Empire. King Ashoka, in order to bring them all together, really waged quite ruthless wars and contributed to hundreds of thousands of deaths, which he actually later regretted, that for the killing of so many people and the wars contributing to so many loss of lives and casualties and destructions. And he actually recanted a little bit, and probably that is part of the reasons that why he really wanted to support the cause of Buddhism as a peaceful and non-killing, as well as more probably vegetarian ways of life. So initially he conquered extensive territories, and he is instrumental in propagating Buddhism. He actually actively sent out monks to the Persian Empire to the west, but also to Central Asia to the north, as well as further to the eastern part of Asia, including China. So as a matter of fact, that kind of influence, although the earliest written documentation of the Buddhist arrival to China probably could be traced back to the turn of the millennium, 1st century ADE, but the arrival of the monks could be much earlier, even could be during that time. So one of the most important things that we can relate to Ashoka's endorsement of Buddhism is the edicts of him. There are over 30, all sprang up, scattered in India, as you can tell here. So major rock edicts, pillar edicts, and minor rock edicts. There are over 30 of them, like this one. Interestingly, again, it reflects the Greek influence. So for example, this very important one is bilingual, and it was discovered in Kandahar and could be traced back to 260 BCE, and it was written in Greek and Aramaic. Aramaic language is an ancient Middle Eastern kind of script and language. Still, there are people who can speak this language, but it's kind of more at the verge of really, it's an endangered language. This is the kind of archaic form of that. So it's very detailed, this edict, and as you can probably later read from the translation, and such as if some were intemperate, they have ceased from their intemperance, as was in their power, and obedient to their father and mother, to the elders. So it's also kind of very much about how to behave and ethics in community relationships and family relationships as well, and how to live a happy life. And the second endorser of Buddhism and patron would be 300 years later, Kanishka the Great. Kanishka the Great is the ruler of the powerful Kushan Empire. And we have mentioned a lot about this Kushan Empire that separates the East from the West, and extremely important in the so-called Gandharian artistic formation, especially visual art. And the visual art is very much reflected, embodied through Buddhist art and sculptures as well. And Kushan Empire, I wanted to remind you again, was most probably set up by the Yuechis. If you remember yesterday, we mentioned how Yuechis would be initially occupying the territory of contemporary Gansu and Heshi corridor. Very powerful, not as powerful as the Xiongnu's probably, but they lived at the kind of largely parallel time as the Xiongnu, starting from 300-400 years ago, and eventually was driven out again due to the conflict with the Yuechi, and migrated northwesternwards, eventually settled in what we now know as probably Afghanistan and northern part of India, and further also some territories of the Persian territories. So you can see eventually setting up, and parts of Fergana and Pamir as well, setting up this Kushan Empire. They are Indo-European semi-nomadic people. And Kanishka is one of the powerful rulers, and he is again instrumental in further spreading Buddhism, because the major religion of Kushan Empire is Buddhism, but also Zoroastrianism as well. Zoroastrianism was also protected and supported. So he actively, again, further supported monks and priests to go further north to Central Asia and east to China. And of course, we would know that Buddhism in Korea and Japan and other parts of Asia would be mostly delivered through China. And the Kushan Empire controlled a very key region of the Silk Road. And just mentioning this again, this sculpture statue of Kanishka, and it was it's a dedicatory inscription with at the hem along the coat, bottom of the coat, that is dedicated to the Kanishka, the ruler. So the archaeologists would know that this is Kanishka. This is at the collection in Mathura Museum in India. So the Kushan Empire controlled the key region of the Silk Road, that is really the heart of the Silk Road, right in the middle. And so if one heart belt side is the northern and southern across the Taklamakan Desert and Tarim Basin, and then meet in Kashgar and further probably Bukhara. But then further, if you go west, then you must go through Kushan Empire then. So that is the second very important kind of center port of the Silk Road. And they also engaged in trade with Mediterranean merchants that would be coming through the maritime Silk Road and communicated with major international empires. And their subjects are really multi-ethnic and multilingual as well as multi-religious. This would be the Gandhara art style, or would also call the Greco-Buddhist art. Again, if you would be quite familiar with this from yesterday morning's lecture, so very much Greek artistic influence there, the nose and arched eyebrows, as well as the curly hair. And as for the robes that the Buddhas would be wearing in these statues, a draped style with all the hams and then the wrinkled draped style of Greek artistic forms. And as you can tell here, this would be the footprint of Buddha. You can see this sign that later was again adopted by the Nazis. As a matter of fact, this sign already existed in the Altaic mountains many thousand years ago in the rock paintings, but particularly in India, much probably can trace back to 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. It's important, especially in Buddhism, it's an important sign. This is a vision of a Buddha's paradise, again, during the time of the Greco-Buddhist art period. Bodhisattva, see the similarities. Buddhist pilgrims from China, so the movement on the one hand is from Indian subcontinent and further from Kushan empires to the east, but at the same time, especially starting from the 4th century, there were also recorded pilgrimages from China, and oftentimes again sponsored by the emperors to go west and bring back Buddhist sutras and manuscripts, scrolls, etc. But then before, for example, recorded documentation of Faxian, there were also other monks who also took the trip, so this was definitely not the first. But the most important ones would be Faxian in the late 4th century, and then Xuanzang, we mentioned this monk from the Tang dynasty period. And this map details their roots. Faxians is quite amazing if you look at that. So he would start from Chang'an, from here, and going through the northern part of the route and eventually coming back from the Himalaya, as a matter of fact, to some extent, reaching to the sea and then coming back from here. So it's really starting from the land route and eventually return from the sea route. Donghuang, this is a screenshot from Google Maps, just to give you an idea where it is located. So this would be Beijing, of course, and Xi'an, this area, would be Chang'an, the ancient capital of China that we have mentioned many, many times. And it was the capital of China throughout various dynasties until the Mongols' establishment of the Yuan. And usually Xi'an is considered as the kind of really active starting part of the trade. Of course, other parts were also connected to this dot, and because it's a capital. And this would be what we considered as the Heshi corridor, or the corridor to the north part of the river. And river, of course, here refers to the Yangtze River, because Yangtze River would, sorry, what I'm talking about, not Yangtze, Yellow River, because Yellow River would be flowing from the Himalayas and through Gansu province and all the way into the ocean in the eastern part of China. So this would be the corridor, very narrow corridor, very dry again, and but that corridor really links China proper to the west, and namely here Donghuang is really the central part to link even nowadays. Of course, not exactly Donghuang, but the wider Gansu area is still the very important section where it links the China proper to the other, to the western part. But in the ancient time, Donghuang, this particular oasis town in the middle of nowhere, really. Now, if we look at it, it is really in the middle of nowhere. It's actually situated in the heart of a Gobi desert. It's extremely dry. You have to drive around about 25 kilometers from the Donghuang city, the oasis now, to the Megao Caves. But thousands of years ago, the Megao Cave site would have been quite a prosperous oasis town by itself. But now, of course, later the change, of course, of riverbeds, etc., and left it really arid and dry. And of course, again, the arrivals of Mongols in the 13th or 14th century, and that led to the decline of Donghuang. But we are going to talk about that later. So from this, we know from Donghuang that Silk Road, these trade routes would be divided to the north from here, because it's impossible to cut through the desert, right? It's a huge Taklamakan desert is there. So then there would be northern route and the southern route, and eventually would one connecting point would be here. And from here, then further to the west. And this would be, again, further to your understanding, would be Donghuang. This is the Heshi corridor, and arriving here, so northern and southern routes eventually meeting here in Kashgar. So more sites. So you can see now Donghuang is here, and it is not far from the end of the ancient, the Great Wall. Of course, now there is only the remnants. It's nothing compared to what we know as the Great Wall, the grandiousness in Beijing, for example, because the Great Walls to Beijing is very much the architecture, the building, the wonder really started to set up during the Ming time. So that would be much, much later, only 400-500 years ago. But this part of the Great Wall would be from over 1,500 years ago. So over there now, you can still see just probably a dimension of, I would say, 6'5" square meters, kind of big mound of dirt, then indicating the wall. So this would be the kind of topography of Donghuang or close to Megao Caves. Again, even Megao Caves is about 15 kilometers from this very famous Crescent Lake, and it is surrounded by actual sand, like a desert. It's quite amazing how this lake, natural lake, it is supported historically by natural spring, but because again climate change and this and that and desertification, now the natural spring is it is difficult to rely on the spring and to keep this lake. So there is this kind of human efforts there, but it's still quite spectacular to go there very early in the morning when there were nobody. Otherwise, just too many tourists there. It's a bit distressful. So why Donghuang is important? It is a vital site for the transmission and globalization. Sorry, why that is missing, I'm not sure. Globalization of the knowledge. It really is the globalization of knowledge there. And transmission as well. And now when we talk about knowledge, we are not just talking about the written things or philosophy or this and that. Yes, of course, it is there as well. But again, people's ways of life. Later, I am going to show you an apology from a drunken man to the host the next morning, in the morning after session, and basically saying, I'm so sorry, I behaved badly and I got drunk. And also the contracts for slave trading, or women's gatherings, the rules and what to bring. So it's really did, and as well as, of course, the medicines as well. Social structures, architecture, music, dance, everything is basically you can find there. That's why it's extremely important. It was, the city itself was somehow destroyed to some extent on the Mongol expansion, but luckily, the caves were gradually kept under the sand again. Some parts, so it was kept. The content was pretty much kept intact until the late 19th century. And the Donghuang Caves was rediscovered during the time of the Great Game. We are not going to elaborate on what is Great Game, but I would strongly recommend you to go, if you have time tonight, just quickly just Google Rudolph Kipling's book, Kim. I don't know if any one of you has read that. It's one of the classics. Apparently, Kim was, I don't know now, but part of the high school reading list in the 80s. So probably your parents' generation would be very familiar with that. Kim's story is about very much situated during the time of the Great Game in British Raj, and how the survival of this young child, boy, becoming the middleman of all the power holders. So very interesting. We are going to talk about that more tomorrow, about Great Game. And this would lead to the establishment of a new academic discipline, Donghuang Studies. Donghuang Studies now is a real discipline, and I'm going to show you some websites. And there is an international Donghuang project based in Hong Kong and the UK. It's just amazing. They do document everything in collaboration with the Donghuang Academy, based in just next to this caves itself. And our very own university, have you been to iCinema? So there is a center, a dome shaped, it's in the, which building I forgot, you know, like over there through the main walk, coming in from the main gate, and they lead to this high stairs, and there is this big building, and on their ground floor, there is a place called iCinema. So it's digitalized cinema for teaching purpose. Until last year, I would organize visitation to iCinema to see the restoration, digitalized restoration of Donghuang Caves. This year, again, because of this situation, unfortunately, I couldn't organize one. But I will see if situation eases, then I will see whether organize something. It's just spectacular. What they did, digital artists and led by Professor Candidine, who worked at Hong Kong Uni, I believe, Hong Kong, yes, one of the university in Hong Kong. She's a historian, but also digital kind of restoration activist and scientist. In collaboration with people, they kind of restore the original images of several caves, just round caves, using all the data from all around the world, whatever they could find. And it's a 3D thing, so you would wear your glasses. And if it is a scene where the artisans and musicians were playing the music and the drum would just come out, and then you would hear the drum music, and the dancer would also come out in front of your eye and would just, they were trying to restore all the movements and the sound as well as the musical instruments used and the color, original color. It's just spectacular. So this is an international effort. They are not just doing Donghuang, but they're also doing works from other parts of the world, especially the endangered kind of historical sites. So just amazing. I think Professor Candidine has moved to, I don't know, probably the US now. She's not here from 2 years ago, but that is a huge legacy. I think even until now, there are only 2 universities host this kind of exhibition. One is us, and one is this Hong Kong, I don't know, City University, where she was based before. So it is quite an experience. So there are, and it is part of the Donghuang Studies project as well. So why Donghuang? Why people set up these caves in Donghuang? One thing we must bear in mind, again, is Donghuang is where people have to come together from the west and east, and they meet there. It's really the place where it is a center where not just trading activities, but other activities also going on. And remember, Donghuang at that time would be, and even surrounding the Buddha caves, still it would be dry, arid, but more not that hostile and natural environment as it is now. And it is, apart from being the trading center, it is also strategically located, especially when it comes to the interest of the Chinese successive empires. Because if they lose Donghuang, then the door is totally open. But if they keep the garrisons and then keep a strong hold of Donghuang, then at least they can keep the other peoples away. So we have talked about that. So Donghuang is really important. And it is the final stop for the Chinese merchants from the east and the first stop for the Sogdians, etc., traders from the west. We're going to talk about the Sogdians this afternoon. And the first written records about Donghuang could be dated to the Warring States period. And Warring States, we talked about that. That would be right before the establishment of the Qin dynasty, the Qin without G. So that was the first time it was mentioned, but it was not the time the caves were there yet. And also during that time, still Chinese people's religious beliefs were very much ancient and surrounded, and it was also the time when Taoism and Confucianism started to really making an influence. But then Yuezhi tribes occupied Donghuang, and we mentioned Hu Yuezhi eventually moved and established Kushans, right? Those are the guys. So how do we know Yuezhi occupied Donghuang and the Gansu region at that time? And that would be from the Chinese sources. But then in the early 2nd century BCE, with the threat from the Xiongnus and confrontations with the Xiongnus. Remember, we talked about during that time, Xiongnu actually grew really big and they became confederacy, and they incorporated not just the Xiongnu tribes, but also smaller nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes. But Yuezhi didn't join them, and they decided to leave, and through the Heshi corridor, they went westwards and finally settling in Bactria and set up this Kushan Empire. Donghuang during the Han Dynasty would be the time, again, the Han Dynasty was trying all its best to guard the Xiongnu and also extended the Great Wall to Donghuang. As you can see here, Donghuang, this Great Wall has reached Donghuang. And we also know it was the time of Zhang Qian's mission, and Zhang Qian definitely would have traveled through the Heshi corridor to the reaching further west. And it was, again, during that time that eventually Han managed to defeat the Xiongnu and set up a garrison and take control of Heshi corridor. And again, it was during the Han time that convicts were sent to Donghuang. So the convicts would be doing the farming. And if they do the farming, they would also bring what? Agricultural technologies there. Because prior to that, this area was occupied by the semi-nomadic people or nomadic people, so there were not much agricultural activities. And it was during this time also these gates were built, that would be the so-called jade gates. And this would be kind of the extension of the then Great Wall as well. That is what is left, pretty much. And Donghuang, at the turn of the first millennium, would be a time of its population growth. And population growth, again, because of the settler communities there. On the one hand is the convicts. On the other hand would be the garrison stationed soldiers. And Han Dynasty did have the policies of granting the soldiers to get married and get settled, and they were divided land. They were given land to tilt so that they can be self-sufficient, and that would, of course, contribute to the population growth as well. And it comes with the intensive agriculture. Then, starting from the convict settler and then later to soldier settler communities, and then gradually it became settler communities from all stratas of lives and from all professions. Even some of the elites would be settled there, especially starting from the officials, of course. And it was quite an important administrative positions to be the governor of Donghuang during that period of time, thinking just to consider about the taxation, the revenues that it would generate, but on the other hand, also the troops stationed there to guard it. And by the late 3rd century, there were already monks started to organize translation team here in Donghuang. But caves were still not built yet. These caves were basically carved out of the dirt cliffs. And it's quite impressive. The cliffs were not tall at all because of the erosions, etc., but still has stood the time. So it was this quite important, influential monk built the first cave in around 366. And these caves gradually expanded from that for about 1,000 years till the 14th century, until the Mongols arrived. So literally 1,000 years of expansions. Exactly because it's very not extremely stretched out. It's just this dirt wall from this end, from the north to the south, just like waterfalls coming down. And it includes monks' residence. It includes study caves. It would include temples, monasteries, and then apart from monks' residences, these caves would be beautifully decorated with artworks. And all these artworks represent different things and different themes. And also, the importance of these Buddha caves exactly rests on the fact that it stretched for 1,000 years. And we would know, for example, the aesthetical appreciation of a woman's body, for example. We would know at some times probably a skinny or a little bit slender woman is appreciated. And you can tell from all these paintings of the either the bodhisattvas or the fairies in the skies or the artisans, for example, or dancing girls. And at some times, like during the Sui and Tang period, in the 6th and probably until the 9th, 10th centuries, fuller-bodied women were very much appreciated. They were considered as the beauties of the world. And women's clothing were also quite actually liberal. Cleavage was shown, especially during the Tang period. And it's very different from Song, for example. After Tang, in Song, this Confucianist kind of ideals, plus other restrictions on women, it contributed to the binding of feet. Binding of feet didn't exist really during the Tang period. Women's feet, these 3-inch lotus feet, really started from that time. And that is less about the erotic imagination of men's of women's feet that was initially considered, well, small feet is considered as erotic and also, attractive and sexual. As a matter of fact, it is not. It is about controlling women's movement, so that, especially if it started from elite women, so that they wouldn't walk about too much. They wouldn't walk too fast. So from these paintings, actually, a lot of these things can also be detected. And of course, the kind of in different historical period, what kind of art, craftsmen probably were doing these paintings, can also, and also people's fashion, hairstyles. So Donghuang in the Sui and Tang periods would be, and this is a very significant period in Chinese history, again, quite prosperous. Sui's territory stopped at Donghuang, and the Sui emperor sponsored the construction of Buddhist structures at Megao, and we do know that it started from mid-late 4th century. We know in a matter of 150 years, then the government itself is sponsoring the construction of Buddhist caves there. And for most of the 7th century, in both, especially during Tang controlled the Heshi corridor and also parts beyond, so extended its territory further west. And this allowed for free flowing trade as well as more security. And it was also Tang established military garrisons along the Heshi corridor, and Donghuang retained a focal point for military preparations. So again, more soldiers were stationed there, garrisons, fortresses were built, communication channels were built. Tang period was really an enormous prosperous period of time in Donghuang. And the constructions of cave temples also boomed during that time. But we need to talk about this guy, An Lushan. An Lushan, historian generally agrees that his mother is Turkic. The father, stepfather, is Turkic too, but it's probably his birth father could be Sogdian. He apparently mastered over 6 different languages, including Chinese and his mother tongue. During the time, Tang time, it was extremely important for those people, for us to remember that those people who were bilingual or multilingual or quadrilinguals, they could easily climb the social status and gain important positions. Because we must remember a quarter of Tang capital, Chang'an, were foreigners. So language is an important tool in breaking the barriers, and we are going to talk about that, especially this afternoon. So especially amongst the trading communities, as well as officialdom, language is important. And because of his various abilities, especially language abilities, he climbed ranks and eventually became a general in the military. We also talked yesterday how in Tang court, foreigners, as a matter of fact, could attain a very high status, not just administrative officialdom, but also in military positions. But because of some feud between him and other High Tang officials, he gradually expanded his own power base and decided to go against the Tang and started this so-called An Lushan rebellion. This rebellion was eventually, Tang actually couldn't by itself kill it down. So what happened was that Tang actually asked help from the Uyghur Empire, Uyghur Khanate to the north, and then also hired mercenaries from Abbasid Caliphate, from the Arab Persian Abbasid Caliphate, about probably 5,000 of them, and fought together against An. Although eventually it was quelled down, but it lasted for another 7-8 years, and it really shattered the Tang's foundation. So from An Lushan's rebellion, gradually, that would be the mid-8th century, after about 100 years, Tang eventually came to an end. And that would be the kind of going down period of Tang. And this also contributed to the beginning point also of Tang's persecutions of and then intolerance as compared to the previous generations during the Tang period, to some religious beliefs and also some foreigners. And then later, both during the Han time, but also, this definitely should be the, it was wrong. It should be Western Han. I was trying to say that should be the BCE from, should be the first 200 years of the Han dynasty, of the Western Han dynasty at the turn of the millennium. Because these two dynasties were both very prosperous, the pinnacles of Chinese civilizations and its power and wealth as well. So it's both during this time that the Chinese empires had a strong grip of power in the Heshi corridor. As for the other dynasties like Sui and Song, they actually gradually lost control of the western, so-called western regions. But during those period, although divided by about 400 years, but the policies to some extent could also resonate. For example, the Heshi corridor was constantly fought over during this period of time, 400 years. And convicts were sent as punishment, but at the same time, the persecuted intellectuals and elites also seek refuge in Donghuang. So they wanted somewhere that are far away from the center. So they would go to the periphery just to keep themselves away from the center. It was also constantly used as an outpost for interactions in military expeditions and defense towards tribes or peoples, either sedentary or nomadic in Central Asia, as well as semi-nomadic peoples. So for about 1,000 years, it is constantly changing hands between different peoples. During the Tang dynasty, Xuanzang, this monk, supported by Emperor Taizong, went to India. And his contribution cannot be underestimated. I did mention the first day of our lecture that his stories were the basis for this Monkey King story. Tibetans played an important role in Donghuang. For example, this is the Tibetan manuscript found in Donghuang. And another very important features of Donghuang contributions is that we learn languages from whatever have been discovered in Donghuang. So some of the languages, manuscripts discovered there, actually people don't use it anymore, and it depends on the various specialists, linguists, to decipher them and interpret them. I think we are going to take a short break of 5 minutes and drink some water, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Because we didn't have time to talk about Donghuang the other day, so I just merged them together. All right. Let's get back. So before we do that, I just did the corrections. So that should be Eastern Han. Sorry, I also made a mistake here from 25, year 25 to 220. So that would be from that time until the Tang. So there was always constant change of power in Donghuang. So Tibet, oh, sorry. Oh, here, sorry, I have to do it again. So made changes there. So there was some mistakes earlier. So would it be from Eastern Han, not a Western Han, from year 25 to 220. Han Dynasty was divided into Eastern and Western, so, but still the continuation, yes. So pretty much divided at the turn of the kind of millennium. And yes, during this time, that would be constant change of powers. So let's look at Tibetans in Donghuang. And we did talk about Tibetans occupied wider ranges of the Tibetan plateau, up stretching to the Qinghai and Gansu region. And early kind of remains could be traced back to at least 20,000 years ago. But until quite late, that would be until the early 7th century. And again, early 7th century, let's think about Tang Dynasty. That was about the time the Tang Dynasty was established as well. Tibetan area was very much fragmented. Again, just like many other places until it is unified. So it was Songtsan Gampo who unified Tibet and established a kingdom. And it was also this guy who sent an ambassador to Tang, and some formal diplomatic connections were established. There were, again, just like the Tibetans were not strict, they're pastoralists, and they did have a military conflict with the Tang border as well, especially to the east, but not as fierce as what Tang had with the other semi-nomadic or nomadic peoples. But the confrontations were there. But then both sides were quite eager at times to establish formal diplomatic connections, but also peace. And one of the measures, again, taken would be what we called about marrying off the princesses to the Tibetan kingdom. So Tibetan kingdom would be from the time of Songtsan Gampo would be a great empire with access to Southeast Asia, China, South and Central Asia. This would be the territorial expansion of the Tang dynasty. So you can tell that this would be the He corridor, and Tibetan empire would be stretching up north, closer to Qinghai, Gansu border. And if there is conflict and confrontation, it would be mostly this area. It would be hard to imagine the Chinese Tang troops come right to the heart of the Tibetan plateau, because the environmental conditions simply wouldn't allow that to happen. Tibetan culture was pretty much open to Indian, Chinese, Islamic, and also Greek culture. And there are some small numbers of Muslim Tibetans as well in Tibet proper, even now. In the early time of Tang, China and Tibet remained friendly. And Tibetan king even received a Chinese princess as, a friendly kind of exchange part of the process. And this historical fact is very much used by the contemporary Chinese government as, the ethnic harmony from thousands of years ago. So it's very much part of the popular culture and political narratives as well. Very similar to, not similar in the dynamics, but just in how these narratives kind of trying to build, work towards the contemporary nation building. It's very much part of this, all these stories. And TV dramas would be made and shown, and some of them a little bit cringe-worthy, but I don't know. This is still there, but let's try to play this TV drama that is TV series that was made, I think, several years ago, about 2 decades ago. This is the time that, okay, it's here. When the princess arrived, it's unlike the Han, was her name Zhao Jun, I think, the one who wrote the poem, very sad, I'm going to the desert land, I'm never going back, and the moon is even sad. It's very different. And this one, this Chinese princess is all happy. Or she's just this adventurer. And she immediately falls in love with the Tibetan king and already started to speak the language. And Tibetan elders would look at her and just say, oh, our princess. So it's very ideological. It's a very, yes, you will see. Interesting. Princess Wenchen. Her name is Wenchen. So this series, this episode is called The Sacrifice. So probably the sacrifice of the.
你不会把我吧？去热闹西藏，对不起。
Oh, there is English subtitle, which is great. What is this?
我只有一点，他心情这么愉俺们幸福经验，我们搞错记忆。我要陪公主，你公主陪我学的，公主陪个啥子用做更加体验，这两个让他推了体外感兴趣的主。
想带我去什么好去处？我发现有很珍惜体能体呢。
这是啥子？
对不起，我还放就自由嘛的。这。
兄弟也是。
What is this?
他把你是吧？陈阳自个来解决啥时间的个？陈阳就当在这些节别的没事呢。俺这这地，他这个东西可不用过去，我了解了。
So it's very patronizing. When are we going to be like the Tang? So. So this narrative of the Han Chinese helping the ethnic minorities are very much already illustrated here. So it's again very internal Orientalistic kind of interpretations of that.
这点都把他想的，那是一点都讲过的。这个年纪也是大，说是这样子都是吧？为王统的婚姻。公主，你是很是难头的啦。啊，公主，你知道给我说过的名字，我听了你说的事，这是这就大。他的东西，日子不年轻，你他妈干啥的？南京是我双山岗的事。 上山不需要的，那听没点了。什么那个是那需要的？你没事呐，是那听不懂。你是那奇怪的，年轻人没真是，让我总在起码上。我心里10多年了，我心里只感觉我的苦过。你什么什么都拍的，天主，他在你什么都没，你说是清楚的。你这个吧，光是看到挺难事。
你有没有听呢？
那是不是？你有听见不？说你们那年，
对，在几乎对。
但是相信就是，你只有他。可怜那我。
真不，我们也没说错的。
我这是有对对，你是哪里？
So in any case, just a sneak peek of the. How do I exit from here. All right. Yeah. Yes, how the past really inform the present, especially in the sphere of politics and especially in nation building process. So this would be Wen Chen, and this would be in some Yes, she did actually. As we mentioned, that it is at the early stage of Tang that Tibetans actually, that the empire had a quite close connections with the Tang. So then comes the later period in the 8th century and 9th century. It was during this time that Buddhism was introduced into Tibet. Some argue that it probably kind of went partly with the princess herself, but again, it cannot be verified. In 776, Donghuang was taken by the Tibetans. So you can imagine, prior to that, Tang actually was in control of the Donghuang area. And then it was taken over by the Tibetans. And here, with the Tibetans' role, Buddhism took up even more dominant position there. Buddhism was protected, but other religions like Zoroastrianism as well as Manichaeism also existed in Donghuang side by side. In about 70 years, Tibetan lost control and Tang regained control. So it's very much tossing about. But during the time of Tibetans' control, they had a very close connections with the Buddhist Khotanese kingdom in the southern edge of the Taklamakan Desert. And they also had very close interchanges with the Uyghur kingdom in the Turfan area. So this would be, again, just to give you an example, different naming of this Uyghur kingdom. To the north, Kocho, or the spelling could also be Kocho, and Shizhou would be the Chinese way to say it. But Kocho and Kocho would be the indigenous way to call this kingdom. But then in the 9th century, after losing Donghuang and also letting go of the friendly connection with the Tang, Tibet entered a long period of monastic rule and isolation. So Tibet really didn't play such an important role in the trading kind of activities along the Silk Road. But the strategic importance was very crucial, and it is still crucial now. And one of the reasons why Tibetan area is so important is because of the Himalayas and also the Tibetan plateau is the sources of big rivers, like the Mekongs that provides water to the southeast countries like Vietnam, etc., Cambodia, as well as Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers, or spring up from the Tibetan Plateau region. So strategically, it's important. Again, because of its natural environmental situation, even if there is rich mineral resources, of course, but it would be quite difficult to excavate, which is a good thing, I would think. But yes, but strategically, it's extremely important. So with the Tang dynasty, Tibetans always remained as a kind of a love-hate relationship, just like the previous nomadic empires we did talk about. And they strive to coexist, and there is constant change of power relations as well, especially at the periphery. But most importantly, trade relations and exchanges of ideas through all the peaceful and conflict-ridden times, and this similarly applies. But again, when it comes to mid-13th century, just like everywhere else, throughout Eurasia, Tibet went under Mongol control. And it was also during this time that the Mongolians gradually also accepted Tibetan Lamaism as well. So recognized the spiritual leader as the Dalai Lama. Not all of them, but significant amount of them. Because I think I mentioned how Mongolians also practice very syncretic kind of religions, infused Buddhism infused with shamanistic practices and animism as well. So how about the Khotan kingdom? So just briefly mention, because Khotan kingdom and Khotan archaeological sites, apart from the prehistorical people, those mummies, it is also an important site for us to understand Buddhism. If not discovered, the materials discovered in Khotan itself, but many were discovered to the northern part of the Khotan kingdom where it stretched to, but also in Donghuang, particularly because Khotanese kingdom, if you see, it is here actually, quite far away from Donghuang here, but from Khotan to Donghuang, they would be taking the southern route, unlike Turfan, which is here. So that would be through this route. And Khotanese kingdom was actually quite wealthy. Especially one of the reasons was because of their jade. Jade is important, particularly for the Chinese elites and emperors, the high class. Until nowadays, jade is important. We are going to talk about the trading of jade and importance of jade this afternoon. But Chinese people value Khotanese jade until these days. I should have brought a jade ornament of mine gifted by a friend. So it is Khotanese jade. I think Burmese jade is also valued, but I think it is more very different from Khotanese, because Khotanese jade apparently kind of was made from the mountains and eventually would end up with the water in the riverbed. So nowadays, when the jade merchants, they try to look for jade, they would destroy the riverbed, which is the heart and the soul of this region. And that, again, we are going to talk about it this afternoon. So Khotanese, on the one hand, they're very famous for their jade, as jade providers, but on the other hand, they also established this very powerful Buddhist kingdom. And their language was Indo-European. And of course, later Khotanese were assimilated to the Uyghur culture, and also they just call themselves Uyghurs, of course, integral part of the Uyghurness. But they would speak during that time Indo-European language, and they were converted by the Karahanids, the Islamic State, in the 10th century to become Muslims. But their Buddhist heritage is very strong, and especially reflected through the Donghuang caves and silk paintings, etc., and the writings as well, because the Khotanese kings, they were the patrons of Donghuang caves. So they would give money, and they would go for pilgrimage to Donghuang. So they were there, for example, here, a depiction of Khotanese king in Donghuang Buddha caves and Khotanese princesses. So quite close connections. And this would be the Khotanese donor ladies. And this was found also in Donghuang. It is a Buddhist guardian deities kind of painting, drawing rather, inscribed with Khotanese. And Khotanese would be an Eastern Iranian language, so Indo-European language. And this is written in Brahmi letters, and it translates as "These will save kids from plague." So it's a kind of a well-wishing thing, probably, that you can carry with you. And in early 14th century, the Mongol Yuan dynasty again conquered Donghuang, As we know, we did talk about the Mongol Yuan Chinese dynasty expanded its territory. Why? Because during the Song period, after Tang, it again shrunk. And then it was during the Mongol period that it expanded again. And it conquered Donghuang. But that time still didn't include what we now know as Xinjiang. The expansion was more to the north, to the Mongol territory. For example, in early 14th century, about 10,000 Mongolian soldiers were stationed there. So you can imagine the importance. And it was during that time as well that Tibetan Buddhism was very much, took strong hold in this area, expanded more with the Mongol influence. And still, some of the ethnic groups in this area and stretching to Gansu, wider Gansu region, they still practice Tibetan Buddhism. Under Ming, Ming would be after Qing, short-lived. Donghuang was administered by local chiefs. So Ming didn't have direct, very centralized control of Donghuang. It was more kind of a princeling kind of political status there. Then again, in the 16th century, occupied by the Tibetans. But during that time, in the 16th century and earlier 14th century, remember, one of the Mongol empire would be the Chagatai, and Donghuang had quite close connection with the Chagatai Khanate as well, because it's just at the western doorstep. It's just next door. So that would be the Tibetans' role, and also Donghuang up until Ming dynasty. But we do know Donghuang's prosperity came to an end with the Mongol occupation, and especially when the Mongols left, and Ming didn't pay that much attention to this part of the world, and gradually the funding, etc., waited out. So how these caves were discovered? These caves are located in Donghuang, but generally they are called Megao caves. Megao, literally it would mean there is nothing higher or more elevated. It's more a kind of from a more religious, spiritual sense. It is located 25 kilometers from Donghuang city in the Gobi Desert. And again, when we talk about Donghuang, you must always remember that a lot of the features are would be quite, could be easily shared by any other oasis. This dryness and precariousness of livelihood, dependence on water, importance, strategic, but also economic importance of these places. And it was in 1900, this, actually he's a Taoist monk called Wang Yuanlu. He discovered the library cave absolutely just very accidentally. So it was actually covered under the sand. He discovered it absolutely by accident. But he didn't know the significance yet. So there were over 50,000 pieces of sutras, documents, embroideries, silk paintings, as well as other kinds of paintings. And the caves consisted of 400, nearly 500 caves in the southern area and about 250 in the northern area. Northern areas were mostly living quarters of the patrons and pilgrims, as well as monks. So 45,000 square meters wall paintings, as well as more than 3,000 painted sculptures. But I also wanted to remind you that during that time, 1900, China, that would be the Qing dynasty with a G, was experiencing an extremely tumultuous time, both from outside and also inside. From outside, there were opium wars, and there were Japan's kind of encroachments and a war with Japan's during those decades. 2 times opium wars with the British Empire, and it's very much just at the toppling end. But internally, disease, natural disasters, droughts, floods, but also bad administration. So both sides were really, and also nationalistic sentiments were growing amongst the Han Chinese. And and then the reform, the Qing court, at the end of the 19th century also tried to go through this so-called reform, educational, social, military reform, like what the Japanese did, the Meiji reform. But what the Japanese did, actually they were successful in the reform process. Well, successful, what I mean is they achieved what they wanted to do. That's what I mean by successful. But the Qing dynasty didn't. It only lasted for, that is called the failed 100-day reform. All the reformers, most of them were executed or escaped to Japan or Hawaii in some cases. And it was these reformers, the remnants of these reformers and revolutionists gradually, and they became the more radical ones, equipped by revolutionary ideas, both in Japan but also the Western ideas, and they started to form alliances and they started to form parties, and they started to say, okay, let's get rid of the barbarians, that would be the Manchus, the foreigners, and then let's take over China. And so eventually, of course, Qing dynasty came to an end. And you can imagine under this very, very politically precarious situations, the Qing court hardly had time for these caves or any archaeological discoveries, etc. So the heart was not there, and mentality was not there either. So that really created a kind of a convenient niche and a vacuum, a void for the foreigners, so-called foreign devils, to come with advanced equipment, cameras, and mapping technologies. And then they heard about the discovery of these caves, and all these materials would be later proven to be amazing for the study of history, not just local history, Asian histories, but also world history, religions, economy, politics, peoples, languages, literature, art, science, and technology. So it's really an encyclopedic kind of discovery there. And this would be the full facade of these caves right in the middle. So you can see how this dirt cliff is not that tall and carved out from these cliffs like this. It's magnificent, whatever left there. And this would be inside where musicians and dancers, and this would most probably from the time of Tang Song, as you can see how women were depicted in these paintings, very plump and full-bodied women and artisans. And it is also from these paintings actually many dance movements from that time could be kind of understood and recomposed, as well as people's clothes, hairstyles, fashion, but also musical instruments. What kind of musical instruments these orchestras were using. One thing we must mention was Chinese courtly music was very much influenced by the music from the West, that is those Central Asian and Persian regions. And many of the instruments like huqin and erhu, etc., were the kind of, when there is this word hu, very much reflects those were the foreign instruments. And during the time of Tang, the Tang court particularly had an appetite for music and artisans from the Western regions. So they incorporated it a lot into the courtly traditions as well. And this is the famous number 17 caves. And if you do go to Dunhuang now, I believe only 9 or 12 caves are open to public. Others are still protected or under renovation process. And also it's very fragile. And I am one who is really into just close of everything, not for touristic purpose, because I think now they're doing a better job, but it was scary to go there 15 years ago and all these tourist groups with their big loudspeakers and 20, 30 squeezed in one cave, and I just feel the dirt were coming down from the wall. So it's kind of extremely precious, really, but delicate as well. But I think now the local government also has restricted the amount of tourists can actually visit the caves, so which is good. And this would be the still existing ones there, still there. And this is from much later time. This would be from the time of Yuan, and this is the stele of Sulaiman. Sulaiman would be considered as a high official, Muslim official, most probably a Hui Muslim official at that time. It was written amazingly in 6 languages. Lainza and Fagspa were kind of Tibetan script, or at least some scripts and languages that are related to Tibetan, but there is also Tibetan and Old Uyghur and Tongut, as well as Chinese. Very impressive. And talking about the discovery of Donghuang, and we have to mention about Sir Aurel Stein, a figure that we are going to talk about quite in detail tomorrow morning, because he is really, really important in the archaeological work of not just Donghuang, but also in Xinjiang. Extremely influential. He is a Hungarian-British archaeologist. He led 3 expeditions. That is, the first one would be to the Taklamakan Desert, and then the second, then he went to Donghuang 2 times after the discovery of the caves. And these would be the items that he actually took to Britain via India. I believe, I don't know how many of them actually, if I'm not mistaken, I believe one of them has been returned to China. And again, these cultural relics that are in possession in foreign museums, especially Western museums, the future of them is something that we needed to think about, and we are going to talk about it tomorrow. So the kind of, yes, who they really belong to, where they should really stay, whether they should stay in Beijing or in the British Museum. So these are the things that we really needed to think about. And this would be the mummy that he actually discovered in Taklamakan Desert, but he covered it. He took a photo and he covered it and then left it there. Yes, so he actually visited Donghuang, and he took a lot of things from Donghuang and thousands of manuscripts. But one thing that makes his discovery different from the French sinologist Pelliot is that this guy, he arrived in 1906. 1908 he set out. It took him 2 years to arrive in Donghuang. The difference between him and Aurel Stein is that he's a sinologist. That is, the person who trained to study Chinese language and Chinese culture, particularly language. He's a linguist as well, and very accomplished. So when he arrived there, from his descriptions, he basically said he just was so scared when Wang, the monk, was basically carrying the lamp or the candle and just walked into this absolutely dry this library cave, and he was so scared that it was just lighted up and then destroyed in an instance. So he was being very, very careful. So his advantage of being a sinologist actually helped him, and also understanding a little bit of the Sanskrit, etc., to distinguish the most valuable scripts and scrolls there. So what he took, while Aurel Stein took randomly whatever he could carry, actually, the ones he left there probably he just couldn't carry anymore. But Pelliot did proper research. He looked through them and he chose those most significant and important ones. And what Stein took are mostly now in British museum collections, and what Pelliot took would be in the Bibliothèque in Paris. So what he took, what Pelliot took, would be numbering over 10,000 pieces. And there is really interesting, if you are interested, you can look through this Chinese academic, a historian in the US. He posts some really interesting Twitter things online. Oops. So this one is apparently a film, Japanese film, called Donghuang, probably much, much early time, because Japanese scholars also went there. And Japanese always have a fascination towards Central Asia, Silk Road region, etc. And this apparently, this is a scene from Japanese movie. Donghuang recreates the hasty construction of Library Cave, this Donghuang Library Cave, as Tangut armies approached. Tangut armies would be the semi-nomadic armies. This is Pelliot's theory. What Pelliot thinks was that why these scrolls and then these manuscripts must have been kept quite scattered in these caves, for example, at the Buddhist priests or monks and disciples' rooms. But now they have these piles and piles of, things put in one cave. So he thinks that probably there was this, the Tonguts in the nomadic tribes in the surrounding areas were approaching and trying to plunder. And words came, and they were trying to, put them all together to save them. But Rong Xinjiang is quite a famous historian of Silk Road and Chinese studies, especially Silk Road studies in China. And he argues that it was carefully planned after Karahanese Sultan conquered the Buddhist Khotan kingdom to the west of Donghuang. Karahanese is, I mentioned, was the one kingdom in Xinjiang to the north, would be the ancestors of the Uyghurs who converted to Islam in the 10th century and then waged a war against their neighbors, the Khotanese Buddhists. And it took 100 years to convert the Khotanese Buddhist kingdom to Islam. And Rome would be arguing probably they heard the rumors and then they put all there. So it's quite interesting that they hastily kind of going through all this. This is an interesting thread. I don't know why the earlier part was not showing. I don't know how to. Oh, here actually. So if you are interested, I'm going to link this on Moodle so you can go through about the hidden library caves that he has all these translations and interesting things here. All right, let's get back to our. Yes, so that would be Pelliot, and some of them are written in paper, silk. They used all kinds of materials, and this would be the library caves. And Russians also were interested. Oldenburg, he made an expedition to Donghuang much later, about nearly a decade later compared to Pelliot, and he left with several hundred scrolls and fragments. Think about that, even after the visitation of Stein and Pelliot, still there were hundreds for these people to take. And now there are about this much, 365 scrolls and approximately 18,000 fragments in the Donghuang collections in the Russian Academy. And then there's Otani. He sent two explorers to Donghuang a bit before Oldenburg, and obtained more than 400 scripts, and they are now in two different Ryokoko and Otani universities. So what are the contents of this manuscript? So there are both secular and religious documents, mostly Buddhist, but there are Manichaean and Zoroastrian as well to some extent. Largest cache of original documents found along the Silk Road. We also mentioned there are plenty in Turfan as well, and also in Aksu, further down south, and but This is really the largest. And there are 40,000 in Chinese, Tibetan, Old Uyghur, even in Hebrew. There are also administrative documents, like as I mentioned, there are actually slave trading documents here and other trading documents, list for shoppings, for example, students' hand copies. Like students' hand copies probably wouldn't be taken by Pelias because he knows that these are the replicas and they're just probably for practicing or intensifying their religious kind of notions. But Stein wouldn't know. And the earliest dated text was from early 5th century, and the latest text was from the 10th century. So probably it makes sense, although later it was extended for another 300 years until the Mongol arrival. But Rome's argument probably makes sense if they think that probably it was during the Karakhanids waging the war against the Khotanese time that they decided to pull them all together, thinking that Karakhanids might come all the way to this Buddhist site as well, because that was the time, the same time, the 11th, 10th century time. And one of the most significant discovery is the Diamond Sutra. This is the first complete printed book, first. It's dated to 834. There were 7 woodblock printed sheets, and it was apparently commissioned by a Buddhist family. The bulk of the texts are student works, and also after this Anlushan, this part Turk, part Sogdian rebellion, which contributed to the toppling of the Tang, a wider variety of texts were also copied. They also document some military payments as well. For example, this is a pedigree of famous clans. This is from the Tang dynasty. A letter for apology for getting drunk. So a kind host invited guests, and then one of them apparently got terribly drunk and misbehaved probably the next day, and they wrote this and then sent to the host. Yesterday, having drunk too much, I was intoxicated as to pass all bounds, but none of the rude and coarse language I used was uttered in a conscious state, better than Trump. There is a sense of regret there. The next morning, after hearing others speak on the subject, I realized what had happened, whereupon I was overwhelmed with confusion and ready to sink into the earth with shame. So really interesting. And look at this. It is a detailed list of wines and liquors used the second year of the Qiande reign, again in the Northern Song dynasty period, after Tang, in the mid-10th century. A women's club from the 10th century. And this is about a women's club, which still exists in many parts of the world. And it's about rules and objectives of this club, and about starting with the praise of friendships, and if before they come for the feast, what each woman could bring, like oil, flour, and wine, and what would happen if some penalties would occur, and what would happen when a woman decides to leave the club, and 3 strokes with a bamboo, and it's quite harsh physical punishment, as a matter of fact. So really interesting. And it's interesting documents to look into women's world as well. And of course, we learn a lot about ethnography, geography, art. Art would be both about visual art and performance art, architecture, technology, and medicine. Some of the most important works on medicine was also found there. This would be from Middle Tang, picture of entertainers. Look at this. It is absolutely amazing bust of a Bodhisattva. Again, a Bodhisattva. And the reservation and restoration, this would be from Donghuang Academy in Donghuang, and they try to restore it to previous glory. And there is oxidization as well, so some of the colors would turn dark, and then they would restore to its original state. And it's a meticulously detailed work. It takes years. I don't think that they have managed to even completely restore, especially the larger caves, the entire caves. But of course, many caves already plundered, and many images were gone. And this would be the International Donghuang Project. If you are interested to go and take a look, if you decide to write an essay on Donghuang, you can look at a lot of their images. They're amazing, and also translations, etc. And tourism is a big thing in Donghuang, but the protection, of course, has to come with that. This is Donghuang in the digital age. I mentioned the iCinema project. You can check it out online. It's quite amazing. This photo was taken from our own iCinema. As conclusion, so Donghuang played a crucial role in the sustenance of Buddhism and other religions. So music, dance, and paintings left us great legacy. It served as a center for producing Buddhist texts, training literary skills as well. It was a headquarters for Chinese campaigns to the West, gateway combining to link the East and West, and also it is an important place for us to understand the past. Past not just of this area, but the world, really. Okay, I'm right on time, 11:50. Because students get a bit nervous. They send me email, oh, the video lasted only for until 1:50. What have we missed? So, great, thank you very much. We are going to come to trade this afternoon. Just bear with me and storm through this afternoon. Tomorrow is going to be fun. Tomorrow is just storytelling. So